For anyone interested, I thought I would do a brief primer on vintage folk and fairy tale art, vis-a-vis what they call the golden age of book illustration. You're getting a blurry fast-forward view through my picture essay on the subject. I created this as a reward for my Kickstarter backers who helped me publish Children and Global Folktales, but I wanted to share a condensed version of what I learned and, more importantly, just these awesome images, these awesome vintage images on my channel. So this is a great little piece of art history. What happened was in the late 19th century, in the Victorian era, book publishing became cheaper, especially the publishing of images and color images. Well, the game really changed once you could produce what we would call picture books at a reasonable cost. The appetite for these turned out to be vast, and a part of this was that Victorian ideas on education were taking shape, and classical tales were seen as a great way to educate children, and lavishly illustrated books featuring those tales then became quite popular. Yet another factor in the equation was that art at the time was changing. So Art Nouveau, a little bit later Art Deco, and many other interdependent styles and substyles all informed a lot of these illustrations. This all took place in London, which was the center of the Western world publishing universe at the time, and that's how an amazing collection of amazing artists, like Bohemian artist Artus Shiner, responsible for this image here, fueled the golden age of book illustration. And of course, I'm focusing on the children's literature aspect of that golden age. Now, as you can imagine, illustrated children's literature wasn't born at this time. It did exist before, like with this just fantastic piece here. This is from 1862, so it's knocking on the door of what we're talking about. It's by Gustave Doré, French artist. And I think you can see why I chose this to set the stage and talk about the era before the era, if you will. Warwick Goble, what a great name by the way, lived from 1862 to 1943, so just as a history nerd I have to stop and appreciate how much he saw the world change. Anyway, he did this Beauty and the Beast rendering here. Stylistically, this is a really good example of what was popular at the time. As is this work, also by him, tale set in India, and this was a part of the movement as well. This wasn't just Western fairy tales for a Western audience. There was an appreciation of and interest in stories set elsewhere, traditional stories. Speaking of that, Edmond Dulac, Frenchman who became a British citizen, illustrated this. It's entitled The Nightingale. Boy, I could definitely go for an entire book based on this aesthetic. So here we have something set in the Far East, obviously. The Near East was quite popular as well. We talked about India. Here's something from Arabian Nights. Great color scheme. Well, I think everything on here is great, or I wouldn't have included it in my video. It's by Anton Pieck, or Pieck. I'll have all the artists' names and spellings in the video description. Anyway, he did great real-life street scenes, like realistic art, which is interesting, because it's in such contrast to this. He was a Dutchman, by the way, so he really had in London this multicultural, international, unofficial art collective. This poster was a staple in children's bedrooms for generations. It was made in 1930, so it's a little bit outside of the bounds, but not by much in what I mostly am dealing with here. But isn't this great? So this is an amalgamation of, fairy tales or fairy tale lands. This was by Haro Hess, who ended up moving to the United States and seemed like a very interesting guy based on his bio. He dabbled in many fields, not just art, was in the French Foreign Legion, went AWOL from there, and was a stowaway on a ship at one point. Swedish artist John Bauer has a really inimitable style. It's very magical. If you're looking at this and saying, this kind of reminds me of the Dark Crystal, that's because his art was an influence on the design used in that movie. I've got to include 3 pieces in a row by him because I'm a big fan. His art is best remembered for works like this, where he was working with Scandinavian folklore. His career was tragically cut short, along with his life, when he and his family died in a boating accident. The steamer they and others were traveling on capsized on Lake Vattern in 1918. But he left his mark. People are still appreciating his work to this day. Now for something really different. We talked about the Western appetite for foreign tales. Well, that was catered to in Japan at the same time by Takahiro Hasegawa, who created the Japanese fairy tale series. He thought of it just for Westerners living in Japan at the time, especially in Tokyo, and he enlisted some of them in translating the actual stories. So this was a way to introduce traditional Japanese stories to American and European children. But what you've no doubt noticed by now is the look of the paper. Isn't that great? It's called crepe paper, and it was used to try to emulate the look of older Japanese books. I own some antique books and actually read them and love handling the old paper, but I can only imagine how nice one of these must feel. Here's one of my favorite artists that I came across. Virginia Sterrett only lived from 1900 to 1931 because she contracted tuberculosis, and that really limited her output, as did the fact that she had to drop out of the Art Institute of Chicago because of her mother's failing health. She was just a Midwestern girl who never got to study abroad or, hobnob with the overseas artists who formed the center of this movement. She never got to be a part of that scene. Kay Nielsen, originally from Copenhagen, Denmark, is an artist you should definitely know. He ended up in London as a part of everything we've been talking about, quickly became a hit there, contributed to multiple volumes, but his real claim to fame is that he contributed to the Disney masterpiece film Fantasia, and he's also remembered as kind of the one that got away from Disney. He was a rising star in their design and art circles, and for some reason they let him go. This work here is by him as well, and features that real classic Art Deco style. I kind of think of it as like this Great Gatsby era art. Here's one by Scottish artist Anne Anderson. She was really prolific, and her husband was an artist as well. That's something that came up in my research more than once. You'd have artists meet in art school, and then they'd get married, and both contribute to this golden age. Well, one more from that age. This is by our friend Edmund Dulac. It's entitled The Garden of the Woman Learned in Magic. I hope you enjoyed the brief history, and especially the images. There was, I think, 16 in this video. I have 57 in my essay. This video is a spin-off project of a spin-off project, because the essay was a Kickstarter reward for the previously mentioned Children in Global Folktales. And that book, which is still in the works, I'll be very happy to update this video description with a link to it, is not a picture book. It's a collection of folktales, focusing on the tales. So it was neat to find a way to delve into the art, the graphic art side of fairy tales, folk tales, and the like. Thanks.